sharing that with us and sharing your song and prayer to open this discussion that is, again, so important and it has been lacking within the work that I've been doing with equitable development here in the Twin Cities. And so with that, I would love to introduce the others who are here with us. And I'm going to let them do fuller introductions of themselves. But along with Darek, we have John Williams joining us from NACDI as well, and Tatewin Means, who is joining us from Thunder Valley CDC in South Dakota. So if you each would like to do your own introductions, please.
Tatewin, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Hamidakiapi Iuha Chante Washtiana Pechizapi Tatuya Dopanajawi means Amachiapi. Greetings, relatives. I shake each of your hands virtually with a good heart. My full name is actually Tatuya Dopanajawi, which means the woman that stands with the four directions. It was my paternal grandmother's name, but you all can call me Tatewin for short. I am Sisseton Wahpeton Dakota and Oglala Lakota, and I'm currently the executive director for Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation in the heart of Oglala territory. This is my father's homelands, and born and raised here my entire life in what is now called South Dakota. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today.
Hi, everyone. I'm John Williams. I am Lakota. I am enrolled at the Cheyenne River Tribe in South Dakota. I currently am the Vice President of Development for the Native American Community Development Institute here in Minneapolis. We do our work and we accomplish our mission through three distinct areas of work. First, our arts and culture, our All My Relations program. We have a gallery on East Franklin Avenue and a little yellow building, which many of you are familiar with. We're more than just a gallery. We do a number of engagements in the community. We have a Native Authors program, which I'll get into later when we talk about voices and equity. We have a civic engagement and voter mobilization program called Make Voting a Tradition. I'll let Darek talk about that as he is the manager of that program. And then we do food sovereignty work with an urban farm here and a farmer's market under the brand of Four Sisters. Many of you know the Three Sisters as an agricultural practice, and we added a fourth sister with wild rice and or people. So just so you know that. But NACDI also does a number of things in our community that we don't always get credit for, but more in community engagement work. We work with a lot of white-led institutions as they try to center Indigenous voices into their DEI work. We've done all sorts of work with the large arts institutions here. Many of you remember Scaffold from the Walker Art Center, and NACDI became a centering location for community to talk with a large institution about why that was a boneheaded move. And they took it down. And so that is the kind of work that we're here for. I want you to think of NACDI as a resource. We are at the hub of the American Indian Cultural Corridor, and I'm happy to be here today. I'll turn it over to Darek.
Oh, thank you, guys. Darek DeLille. As John stated, I'm manager of Make Voting a Tradition, or MVAT. For short, we are a culturally specific year-round multi-generational program. And what we're doing out here is engaging civically from elders to the youth. And that's really, that's a big part of my job. I have a strong coworker who's been here for about 4 years now. Our program has been around for 9 years now, so it's very established. My coworker Jolene Jones is strong at what she does. She's the person on the block, hitting the streets, doing a major part of the work. So I couldn't go on without mentioning my coworker. A big piece of the work that I'm going to be doing is building out the program into a more statewide venture. I want to be engaging in a civic manner across the state from St. Paul, but I also want to hit all of our tribal nations, and I want to be able to, at some point, I want us all to sit at a table and get together and get all of our ducks in a row. I want us to all speak somewhat of the same language and be on the same page as far as who's in our offices, what are they doing in those offices, and what can we do to infiltrate. I've used that word before. I think it's a strong word, but I think it's the correct word, to infiltrate and see what we can do about getting systems changed. As John stated, a lot of beautiful facts about NACDI. One of the beautiful facts about NACDI is we're a systems change organization. That's what we're going to work for, and that's what we strive for. So I really appreciate all of your time today.
Thank you, John, Tatewin, and Darek. You know, again, with the work of the Equitable Development and the Enthusiast group, and thinking about how we practice equitable development in our communities is a principle within the livability principle is around understanding the history of the communities that we're doing equitable development, you know, with or where we are doing it. And so I think, again, this conversation is really important. And so Tatewin is going to start us off in offering some history. So Tatewin.
Thank you. And again, thank you for all of you being here today. I think it's interesting that, you know, when I'm asked to do these kinds of conversations and to share a bit about our work at Thunder Valley, or you know, in these kind of shared spaces, that there always has to be some type of intro to Indigenous history. And it's a bit frustrating because, you know, as the original occupants of this land, you know, for many generations, it's the first history that everybody should learn. I remember going through school. I grew up here in the Pine Ridge Reservation and went to a tribal school. And even then, at that time, not learning about our people's history, our Indigenous people's history, as a part of the standard curriculum that the school had to use, right? All of the state standards across the United States don't require Indigenous people's history. And so, you know, there's a great read called The Indigenous People's History of the United States that I would suggest everybody read as a starting point in your own Indigenous history educational journey, because it's something that the onus shouldn't always be on Indigenous people to educate people. That should be a part of everybody's upbringing and educational experiences. And that is something that each of you could start in your own home with your own children and family and relatives. But I did want to just kind of lay the foundation for this conversation, because to understand the magnitude and scope of the work that happens in Indigenous communities by Indigenous organizations, particularly, you have to have some type of foundational understanding about the United States government and the Catholic Church's history when it comes to federal Indian policy and Indigenous people here on Turtle Island. And so I think it's really important to share that and ground ourselves to understand, especially like here at Thunder Valley, our vision is liberation. We know that the first step towards liberation has to be healing, our collective healing, individually, as families, as, you know, extended families, but also that includes non-Indigenous folks, white folks, healing from colonization as well, and all of the harms and the harmful narratives and worldviews that are associated with that. And so I just wanted to share a bit about some policy eras. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So from the point of colonization forward, you'll see the colonial period. And I think it's really important to note that, the Catholic Church, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull that actually explicitly stated that the native peoples of this country, that Spain and Portugal had the right to colonize, convert, and enslave us. That was the premise in which the Catholic Church, in which the colonists came here to this land, with that mindset of colonization, conversion, and enslavement of the Indigenous peoples here. And, in that process, it set the tone of dehumanization generally for Indigenous people. That's why it made it so easy to eliminate us, to annihilate our food sources. For Lakota and Plains people, that was the bison, to remove us from our traditional homelands and our sacred sites and sacred places. That was the mindset. That is the foundation of this country. It is the original sin of this country. And I think it's important that everyone understands that that was the intention coming here. You have the Confederation and Trade and Intercourse era. This is when a lot of treaties happened around between what was forming as the federal government of now the United States and tribal nations. In fact, in the Trade and Intercourse era, it talks specifically about the federal government being the sole the sole entity that's able to regulate trade with Indigenous peoples. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to pause for a moment. The next era of public policy is the removal era. This happened a lot to Eastern tribes along the United States border. You'll have some pretty, I think, notable points in history. The Trail of Tears happened during this time when a lot of those Eastern tribes were forced westward and really concentrated in the Oklahoma area. You have the reservation era. A lot of treaties, again, still happening here. This particular era affects my people, the Plains people. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 happened in this time, really defining land bases and forcing our people who lived a really nomadic lifestyle onto reservations. And then allotment and assimilation. This is where this idea of Western property law and individual land ownership, which was really foreign to Indigenous people, because we didn't consider land property to be owned or to be controlled in that way. So that concept of ownership was really foreign to us. And it was during this period where a lot of our tribal land bases that were guaranteed as a part of these treaties were fractionated with individual land ownership. And a lot of that land was reclaimed by the government and by other landowners because the failure to pay property taxes. So you have like the General Allotment Act happened in this, the Dawes Act. Essentially, it was a legally authorized way for a land grab of Indigenous land. And then you have the Indian Reorganization Act, where they said, if you want all of these federal benefits that are guaranteed to you in these treaties, you will adopt a constitution that we set out for you. It will always have the approval and oversight of the Department of Interior and the Secretary of the Interior. And you will have facsimile governments, just as the federal government. And so many of the tribal nations adopted these constitutions. They're kind of called the IRA governments today. And then termination, a lot of tribes lost their status. I apologize, I'm not sure what's going on, but lost their status as being federally recognized in this time. And then we are currently in the self-determination era. A lot of promising legislation was passed. You have the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1973. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act in 1978, which had to specifically authorize and legalize the practicing of our own ceremonies and language and lifeways. Prior to that period, it was outlawed. It was illegal. You would be punished by law if you were found to have been practicing in your ceremonies and your language and your lifeways. So it took an act of Congress to say, Indigenous people are able to practice their way of life. You have the Self-Determination Act in education in this era as well. So this is the current era that we're currently in, where a lot of tribal nations are really trying to exercise their tribal sovereignty and reclaiming a lot of these systems. So whether that's education, justice systems, healthcare systems, you'll see a lot of that happening in this era of Indian policy.
Thank you, Tatewin. I don't know if you had some kind of wrapping up comments to that history timeline.
Not really. I just think it's important, as I said in the intro, to ensure that you have a common understanding about Indigenous people and all of these policies. If this was new to you, if these are new eras of US policy that you are unfamiliar with, I think that's a great starting point to begin your education around Indigenous people's history.
Thank you, and very much point taken in regards to the idea of inviting you to be here and then asking you to also start with your history. It's something that we all have a responsibility to do on our own. Darek, John, do you have anything you'd like to add to Tatewin's conversation?
I always have one that I talk about. It's been recurring conversation here lately. It's the fact that when you go to Japan, you get off the plane, and what do you see? Who are you going to meet? You're going to meet Japanese people. There's going to be a lot of them. And I think you might know where I'm going already. But if you go over to Africa and you get off the plane, you're going to see a lot of African people. Now, when you come to the United States and you get off the plane, who are you seeing? I want that to be something you think about, because we should be everywhere. Native Americans should be the largest population in New York. We should outnumber everybody there. We should be the largest population in South Florida, in LA, you name it. We should be all over the place. So something happened there, and I always leave this as an open-ended question. I'd like you to think about that. What happened there? Because those were my relatives. Those were my people. So I'm very lucky to be here. I'm very happy to be here today with you guys. And I really appreciate you guys. It's a beautiful thing to be able to sing that song, because that's some of the oldest stuff that we can remember. I go to my ceremonies and I learn the best I can, the little bit of language that I know, because that was outlawed. Our ceremonies were outlawed. They came through and destroyed our ceremonies. They had destroyed our people because it was a threat in some way. And so I'm very fortunate to be able to have any of that. And I'll leave it with that. I do thank you though for thinking about that.
Juhi, I just want to echo what Tatewin said about that the onus on understanding Indigenous history should not just fall on Indigenous people to tell. We need to learn some things in this country about history. And I know that many of you are willing to do that. Not everybody is. So many of us can grow weary. We're happy to be here today. I don't want to put any bad vibes about being here today. It's just that education, self-education, and delving into that history is really important. One of the things that I think it might be interesting to you all is that in our contracts that we write for artists with white-led institutions, we include an emotional labor clause to that contract. And there is a cost associated with that because many of our artists are misunderstood by those institutions and have to possibly talk about traumatic things. And that has a real emotional labor to it. And we've instituted that in all my relations as a way to protect our artists.
Thank you for saying that, because that was one of the things that I think all of your comments, but particularly Derek's comment, made me think about is that you know, we can listen to Tatewin talk about the history and the timeline and take it as like a history lesson, but at the same time, you know, to Derek's point, that these are your ancestors, these are your people, and this is the extermination, right, of your people that she is talking about, the intentional extermination of your people, and how intimate and personal that is for her to be sharing this history with us. And so I just want to recognize and honor the fact that that's something that I think I definitely would have taken for granted without your remarks. So I really deeply appreciate that. And so with that, I mean, I would like for us to kind of see or learn about like what you all are doing in the areas of equitable development, you know, reckoning with the history that has been put in front of you, and you know, that has, you know, obviously severely impacted and harmed Indigenous communities across the United States and across the world, honestly, with shared practices. What are you all doing now in the work that you do? And you know, I just to be, I don't know if it sounds flippant to be talking about equitable development because that's why we're here, but you know, how are you guys practicing equitable development?
I'll share a bit. So Thunder Valley, we have 8 initiatives that work in a really whole community approach, taking aim at the Indigenous determinants of health. So improving health outcomes of our people. For Indigenous people, I think the average life expectancy is 46 years old for men and 55, 56 for females. And so, you know, in a first world country like the United States, that's absolutely appalling and unacceptable to have you know, the original inhabitants of this land, the Indigenous people to this land, have such low life expectancies. And so the work we're doing at Thunder Valley is really taking aim at how do we improve those health outcomes for our community through our own healing and life ways and teachings. And so a part of the healing is also healing the physical spaces that are found in our community. You know, for so many decades since colonization, how our communities look, feel, smell, everything is dictated by an external force, typically the federal government. You don't see a lot of planned development across reservation communities. It's usually housing areas go up around anchor institutions such as Indian Health Service or the Bureau of Indian Affairs or different schools. You'll just see the need for housing there, so there's houses built. And a part of our work at Thunder Valley through our Regenerative Community Development Initiative is how do we heal those spaces and give our community members the opportunity to have a voice on what our communities look like and feel like. So when we started Thunder Valley, we have 34 acres, a fee simple land. And that title, of course, is important because a lot of the lands in reservation communities are held in trust by the federal government. So the fact that there's a bureau called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a federal department that has to manage the affairs of individual Indians, just shows you how inherently racist the system is. No other race of people has a bureau or a federal department to manage their affairs for them. So the fact that they feel there's this underlying notion that we are incompetent or incapable of handling our own affairs, which is, you know, has been proven wrong time and time again. There's been so many federal lawsuits against the Bureau of Indian Affairs for mismanaging our money. But it still exists. So when we want to get into a conversation around dismantling the BIA, I'm here for it, because it should not exist. We should be able to manage our own, but that's true sovereignty, right? And so when we talk about planned development, fee simple land, we don't have to get approval from the Secretary of the Interior or the Bureau of Indian Affairs to design a community. You know, any other place, you have that attachment to it, this approval from the Secretary of Interior that has to happen before you can do any kind of development. But it comes at cost too, because we're not associated with a tribal government. And so funding these types of planned communities is extremely, extremely difficult. We're rural, we're Indigenous, and we're in a very racist region. And so finding investors to come here and to care about the Pine Ridge Reservation is extremely challenging. So when we talk about equitable development, where are the resources and how are they reaching communities such as ours for efforts that are Indigenous led? We have a lot of church groups that come in here. They're the largest landowners on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and they have millions and millions of dollars coming into their work, but nothing to support Indigenous led efforts here within our community. So on our 34 acres, you know, we did some community sessions, community engagement sessions. And I think that's one value that we hold tightly onto at Thunder Valley, is ensuring that our community members, and especially our youth, have a voice in any type of programming or development that we do. We don't treat community engagement as a box to check, right? Okay, yes, we consulted the community, that's done. Now let's get to business and get this done. So when we did the first rounds of community engagement, it was actually through a Sustainable Communities grant. One of the priorities for the community was housing. At that time in 2012, we were deficient 4,000 homes for the population here on the reservation. And so when we did the first renderings, the first development for this 34 acres, it was just end-to-end housing, all sorts of single family homes, apartments, you know, townhomes, all these varying types of housing. And when we took that back to the community, they said, no, that's not what we want. Yes, we're short housing, but we also want other things in our community. We want places to shop. We want places to eat and to play and to grow food and to have ceremony. We want these places because that's what a thriving community looks like. And so, you know, taking that into consideration, doing additional rounds of design, you know, and really pushing back on these outside design firms that come into our communities and do this work. And another quick example before I pass it off to my colleagues here is we did a playground design, right? And you think how hard can it be to design a playground, right? You put some slides in there and the coolest technology and the rubberized surface, and then you're good to go, right? Well, we did engagement with the community and a lot of young people. And we put together, you know, some of the priorities for our population. We gave that to the design firm. And we said, let's make sure that it's culturally competent. That was a lot of the feedback. We wanted to resonate with our community members. They brought us back a playground design that had a star quilt pattern and a 4-direction symbol. Now, if you know anything about Indian country, those are probably the two most well-known images that you can have associated with Indian people: a star quilt pattern and a 4-direction symbol. And we said, you have to do better. So we gave them some materials to read, some books. We said, oh, and they're available at the public library in Rapid City. Go there, check them out, read them, and come back with another rendering that matches more closely to what our community wants. So we went around a few times with that. It definitely delayed the process, but it was important because we wanted to hold them accountable to our community members. And so what we have now is a playground that is based on 2 Lakota teachings. One is the story of the Great Race, when all of the animal nations raced around the Black Hills and left a red trail, a red path all around the Black Hills, and Black Hills are sacred to us. And so you'll see that on our playground. There's a red sidewalk that marks that. And then our Black Hills are also home to the 7 sacred sites of Lakota people. And so every play structure within the playground is reflective. It represents one of the 7 sacred sites. So as our community members come here, they're able to learn through oral history, through being on the physical structures about some of the important teachings of our people. And so those are just 2 specific examples of how we really try to engage our community and make sure their voice was reflected in the actual design.
We loved seeing the designs, Tatewin, at the Lakota Media Summit. That was really cool. I guess I'll talk about how NACDI is working in this realm. And, you know, first off, you know, we take an asset-based approach to all of our work. We're a systems change, power building, multi-issue organization that is deeply embedded in our community. We don't do anything except what the community wants to do. We listen. All of our programs were born out of communities saying, can NACDI help us do this? Can NACDI help with civic engagement? Can NACDI help with food sovereignty? So these are issues that are incredibly important to Native people. We do not separate our arts and culture work from our other work. It's deeply embedded and cross-pollinating work. Just a little side note here, if you want to understand worldviews of Native people, look at their art. Come down to our gallery and see what we're having. A little shout out here. We have an exhibit opening on Thursday called Abajijiwan, which means it flows continuously. And it's an installation and meditation on the river, the Mississippi River, as our relative. That is the type of art and conversation that you will get from Native and from all my relations arts. These are important topics. This is a way art unites us. Art is universal. It is a real way that you can start to experience the Native American worldview is by attending those events. So shameless shout out, but there you go. We do our work from a perspective that American Indian people have all that they need to be successful. We have our ceremonies, we have our families, we have our communities, our oyates, our tioshpayes. We need to build power. My job as a fundraiser for the organization is to basically let people know that less than 0.04% of philanthropic dollars are directed towards American Indian organizations. And I just want to be clear here, less than 0.04%. That is the most current data we have from the Chronicle of Philanthropy. We can't enter into discussions about how to heal harms and how to look at supporting and providing equity to Native communities until we look at the facts of today. That fact is ridiculous. There are a lot of things that when you talk to a Native person and you look at current policies and broken treaties and the lack of commitment from the resource holders, it's wearying. However, we are making some strides. I believe that we can do better. And I believe, and NACDI believes, that the way we do that is to remain rooted in community, working on issues that benefit the community. Decisions are made at Indigenous tables, not for the individual good, but for the community good. We do everything at NACDI by consensus. That takes a little longer, but it involves all voices in the community. I'm going to let Darek talk about Make Voting a Tradition, because that program really underscores how we're doing equity building in communities.
Oh, Miigwech, John, I think when you talk about developing equitably in a community, our organization does a pretty good job. That's why I'm here. I approach this job in the best of ways that I could. I'm at my root, I'm a traditional person. I've engaged in that way. That's what one of my jobs here on this earth is, to engage in that way and learn as much as I can about those traditions and those cultural ways and the language and our ceremonies and that's important to me. So I'll tell a quick story about how I came here. I volunteered here when COVID hit, and they said, hey, we need some help. I was new to this community. They said, hey, we need some help. We're gonna maybe try to set up this food shelf. And I said, that's where I'm going. I'm going in. I'm going in. So I came down eager to work, and I just wanted to help my people, because it was important at that time to get people fed and make sure people were fed. And man, we set this up so quickly. And I came in and I learned about NACDI right then and there, that they were very good at organizing. They were very good at listening to what the people needed, and they were ready to react with their hearts. And I wanted to mention that we just spoke about this, John, earlier. When you think about a heart, how that heart pumps that fresh blood throughout your body that you need every day. Also, I think of that heart, that's a spiritual connector. It connects, it conveys messages, and it receives messages from our spiritual realm. I believe this 100%, so I know it as true. And in that way, it can work in tandem with my brain, and it can tell me, hey, brain, you might not be thinking right now. You better trust me. It also does that. But there's one really important thing that it does. Now, if you're around a volatile situation, or maybe, let's say, per se, someone's shooting down the block, there's an active shooter, what's your heart gonna do? Automatically, your heart's just gonna say, hey, I need to help right now. I'm gonna pump you this extra blood, and I'm gonna give you this adrenaline, and it's gonna give you what you need. It reacts. And I speak highly of my organization, because I think highly of them. I know what they do in the community. They react when we need to react. We listen to what the people need. So that's why I'm here. And I think of, when we talk about this situation, when we talk about how we're developing within the community, we're out there listening, we're out there engaging. They're hiring people like me. I might not have the professional prowess of my two constituents here. I really look up to my two companions here, but they hired me. So that says a lot. That says a lot in itself about what our organization does, because they value traditions. They value our cultural ways. They value our language. They look at me as an asset, and they lift me up, and they say, Darek, you can go do it. Now, if that isn't proof positive, I don't know what is.
And that's what the heart of community development, right, is building the people. So thank you. So we've prepared two questions to go deeper into this topic of equitable development in our Indigenous communities. And so I'm going to ask you the first question, which is, this group has been together, and we had a Equitable Development Symposium last year, where we brought speakers from across the country to talk about equitable development. And one of the recaps we were able to capture from that conversation of the symposium was focused on land. It was on land, history, and culture, in fact. And in that, we quoted one of the speakers in saying that land is a way to hold political, social, and economic power. So I'd like to ask you all, do you agree with this statement? And what does it mean to you from an Indigenous perspective that land is a way to hold political, social, and economic power? Whoever wants to speak first.
I'll start us off. So I think that, as I mentioned in the intro around the history and the different eras of US policy, when the Allotment Act was put in place, or the Dawes Act, and this idea of individual land ownership was really forced upon Indigenous peoples here, how harmful that has been, and how it continues to contribute to the dispossession of Indigenous lands from Indigenous people. And so I think that, having that type of framework of viewing the land as something to leverage for this concept of power and control, I feel is really harmful. And it continues to contravene every, Indigenous ideology around what it means to care for the land. And so I think that, what I would always encourage is we have to collectively rethink United States property law, of Western, the Western legal system, what property ownership is and what it means and how it's legally defined and how it's transferred and all of those things that are associated with it. I think for us to be able to save the earth and save our humanity, because of the climate crisis that we're in, we have to think about what it means to care for the land in a different way. If we continue to perpetuate and continue this idea of we are the owners and we can do what we want with the land, and we don't have a responsibility to care for it or to rectify the wrongs that we've been doing to her, then we'll cease to exist as a human race, let alone as Indigenous people, as distinct groups of people, because the earth, as my father has been quoted as saying, the earth will retaliate, and she is. And so I think that for our own survival as a people, we have to really challenge those legal frameworks that exist in the Western body of law around property ownership. And if we continue to think about it as something to possess and use and leverage, it's only going to continue. It's just the destruction of the earth. And so I just wanted to throw that out there, because a part of healing from colonization is also rethinking these bodies of law that have been, in place for hundreds of years, but that really do a lot of harm in our communities.
I guess, I'm just kind of caught up by the word hold, to hold land. Just to echo what Tatewin is saying, is that that's not a native worldview. We're in relation to the land. We are interdependent on the land. And so how we hold the land, well, let me just give an example. We own our building here, and that is an asset to us. That's not just an asset to NACDI. That's an asset for every artist that we engage with. That is an asset for the community that comes to see our work. We are the hub of the American Indian Cultural Corridor. Many of you guys have come into powwow grounds. Now imagine going into a coffee house and you have access to the highest quality Native American art in the region. We have our NACDI offices here. There is some stability and some, our balance sheet looks good because we own a building. Okay, so I don't know if that's how you want me to answer this question, Julie, but the assets, what we're trying to do is build more assets for the community, and we do that in a community-minded, Indigenous way.
I think if I touch on this, I'll try to be quick. I agree with both Tatewin and John. When I look at that question, is it a way to hold political, social, and economic power? Well, yeah. I mean, let's look at the United States. It was all taken from us, and they have a lot of, let's be real, they have a lot of social power, political power, and economic power. So to answer the question, yeah. But we've been saying that's the wrong direction from day one. Since 1492, we've said maybe that's not the direction you want to go. And I think that's what my two companions were saying. is that's definitely not our view. I'll tell you, I went out into the woods one time and we were way out up by Canada and there's nothing out there. There isn't even a road out there. So we hiked way out there. And when I was coming back on that path, I saw two animals there and they looked at me, man. They were checking me out hard. And I kept going and a bird was just looking at me just hard. And I kept walking and I saw this squirrel, and it was the squirrel that really got me. A Jidamu was looking at me and he really turned his head. And man, this thought came into my head. And it was almost like a vision. And it was what that squirrel was thinking. And that squirrel, I'll tell you what that squirrel was thinking. That squirrel was thinking, oh my goodness, wow, watch out for those ones. Because that squirrel doesn't normally see us over in that area. Oh, watch out. Those are those powerful ones. I'm going to stay away from those beings. Also, as I walked, I kept walking and I kind of thought about that. I thought, wow, okay. And more came into my head about that. And what else came with that thought and that, I guess, this vision, because I kind of saw it. You don't want to mess with those people. Whoa, they have powers, they're magic. They can make you disappear. They can use stuff that's unseen and kill you. Also, the last thought that came with that was, those are the caretakers. We have to depend on them so our earth continues on. And that's where I wanted to get to, is what Tatewin and John were touching on, is the fact that the land is our mother. We're the caretakers of this earth. So it's really, to answer your question, yes, it does build that. It does. Assets do build that. But at what cost, I guess, that's what I want to bring to the table. At what cost?
And I feel like this question really flows well into the next question around sovereignty then, right? So thank you to Tatewin and John and Darek for, for one, questioning just how we talk about property and land and ownership, because as you're saying, we're asking the wrong question. We are approaching the whole concept in a way that is counter to your beliefs, and really the beliefs that then would care for the land and create that longevity that we all seek, right? And sustainability. And so then, can you help us understand the role of sovereignty within equitable development? I had the privilege of attending the Lakota Media Summit that Thunder Valley CDC and Tatewin's team put together this past week, and learned quite a bit about sovereignty and the role that it has in Indigenous communities. So can you help us understand the role of sovereignty in equitable development, and what does sovereignty mean in this context, and how we can support Indigenous sovereignty in our equitable development practices, and we being the practitioners that are here today?
Well, I'd like some consensus on what sovereignty means. I mean, I guess to me, sovereignty, if I had to define it, is just the ability to thrive and prosper according to our values and our life ways. That's what would be sovereign to me.
I think for me, sovereignty means a multitude of things. One, from a nationhood perspective, it attaches at various levels and in various ways when you're talking about government to government relationships and being a sovereign nation. Of course, US jurisprudence has labeled Indigenous communities here as domestic dependent nations, so not truly sovereign, but quasi-sovereign. And so, you know, the process of fully realizing our inherent sovereignty as tribal nations is something that I think tribal communities are still actively fighting for and trying to figure out what that means. I mean, in a really general sense, it means we have our own governance systems, we have our own bodies of law, we have our own ways to enforce those laws, and are able to educate our own children and those kinds of things that are attached to nationhood. I think at a much more, at a much deeper level, you know, their sovereignty as individuals, right? Self-sovereignty and self-liberation is the first and most crucial component of our collective sovereignty and liberation. If we ourselves are not sovereign, how do we expect to collectively move in a sovereign way and develop in that sovereignty? And so I think that for me, at a really just basic level, sovereignty means when you're freeing yourselves from those chains of colonization, when you're able to live as a Lakota person, as an Indigenous person, as a person from whatever group that you are part of or affiliate with, that you're able to hold on to those identities in their purest forms or as much as possible, and live those values. I think that is a fundamental piece to sovereignty.
I was thinking the same way right when you said free. I mean, that's a big key. Tatewin also mentioned a word that I believe should be tied to the word sovereignty when it comes to Native or Indigenous people. Inherent. That's a key word. Inherent. It is our inherent right to sovereignty. That's in my understanding anyways. I think of sovereignty being our ability to live in the way that Creator intended us to live. I think of sovereignty as being the ability to sing my song as the birds sing their song. The birds have their own song. I'm not going to take that bird and say, hey, you know what? You're not singing this song correctly. You're going to sing a different tune. That's big. I think also one thing that we didn't touch on that goes into sovereignty is being able the ability to either trust or distrust, and the work that goes with that, to stand by what those treaties say, every single word. Every single word, every word that was written in those treaties needs to be upheld, and they are in constant, they are under a constant attack to this day. People can't fish at the rivers over in Seattle. My people can't net over in Bad River. And these type of things are encroached upon. With my people constantly. And we try to stand up and we try to say, hey, this is our treaty rights, but if they deem it not important enough, if they don't want us to do that, they come in with force. And this has been over time after time after time after time. That has to be in there. The treaties and upholding those treaties is very important when you talk about this. So I think that's about all I have for sovereignty.
Juhi, I just want to say a couple things before we get to questions and answers. And I just think it's really interesting that this audience gets to hear how a tribal community development corp is doing community development work and how an urban Native American organization is doing community development work. And I just want to underscore that there's nothing that's pan-Indian. You know, for all of you that are interested in learning more learn about your local tribes first. You know, not the most famous ones. Learn about whose land you're walking on. And, you know, we've said some things today and we've been telling the truth. It's been some Native truth telling here. But I want the audience to know that when we do that, that can lead to healing. You know, so when we talk about these issues and they are fraught with emotions, I had to step away when Tatewin was doing the history. I'm so tired of learning that history. It's really hard for me to listen to. It's in me, I own it, I know what's going on, but sometimes I have to step away from listening to it. And so I'd like you to imagine that when we talk about these things and you're in Native circles, of what that does to the individual that has to explain and put into context all of this shameful history. So truth-telling can lead to healing was my message.
Thank you, John. I think that's really great points to underscore the fact that you all are different communities, the urban Native community, Indigenous community, and the work that you all do at NACDI doesn't mean that that's exactly what needs to happen over in Thunder Valley and Pine Ridge, right? And they're doing it their way, and that's what Tatewin was sharing. And also that the story and the history, kind of like we talked about earlier, is the story of your own trauma. And so asking a person to relive their trauma every time or traumatic events is really wearing for anybody. And to have that depth of trauma that's historic and embedded within your DNA at this point and be continually sharing it with people that you don't know that are going to do anything about it, right? Is also an exercise of trust. And so I just appreciate you sharing that as well. And then also Tatewin, one of your comments earlier and talking about to John referencing healing again, and Tatewin talking about the healing that that Indigenous communities again are needing through colonization, but that also the white people also need to do their own healing and reckoning with the history and decolonize themselves as well. So I appreciate all those perspectives. And this is the opportunity for others to share their perspectives and ask questions. And so if Darek, Tatewin, or John, if you have anything else that you on your mind that you want to share as people get their questions together, I welcome you to share. Otherwise, I invite everybody who's on this Zoom to raise your hand or unmute or put a question into the chat. I think a lot of gratitude has been shared, and then also you can see people shared a bit of who's here, so it's not so opaque. Robert, you have a question? Would you like to unmute?
Yes, are you able to hear me, first of all?
Mm-hmm.
You can, okay. The question I have is that is there a central clearinghouse for community development information for BIPOC communities that gives examples of not only what works in the realm of community development projects in their areas, but why they worked, what made them successful, what is the environmental background, what are the land forms, what is the land use politics all about that enabled such a project to work. We have plenty of examples of what hasn't worked, I suppose, but it would be nice if there were a central clearinghouse. And if there's already one, I'd like to know about it. Although I'm not affiliated with an individual group where I live here in Sacramento, California. Still, I think it would be helpful to any group, rural or urban, for there to be some kind of clearinghouse of information that shows what projects may have worked and why, especially explaining why. And perhaps examples of which ones haven't worked and why not. But we can find more of those. What we want are success stories. And when I say we, I don't mean a group to which I belong, because I don't. I'm retired, but I mean we as all 11 of us or all 10 of us who are here. I'm finished.
Thank you, Robert.
I'm not aware of any clearinghouse I would imagine that there's probably some lessons learned from federal grant projects and other foundations. I would love, Robert, to also know that. However, I can tell you that the things that don't work are when the community is not engaged in designing and implementing programs. And I don't know of a successful organization that doesn't spend the amount of time necessary to do community work. It's not a survey. It's not a couple questions. The community work that we do is deeply embedded in who we are. It provides for narrative and for voices to be heard. And so just from my experience, Robert, it's when the community is not engaged in whatever type of project it is, that's when it's unsuccessful.
I'd add it's also community specific in my work. I definitely have to engage different communities very differently. It's very important that I engage those communities differently. It varies from mile to mile, it seems sometimes, even in the same community. At sometimes I'm in the middle of Minneapolis, so we have so many different people down here that there's just not going to be a textbook for that. I think the textbook is to get in the community and build your relationship in the best of way, in a nice and strong way. Hopefully you can build a lasting relationship. I think that's the key to victory.
I would suggest Policy Link. I was a part of a fellowship that they had on housing as a human right, and they do a lot around equitable development and racial equity. So Policy Link might be a good resource. They have a lot of resources online for you to tap into, and then just reaching out to them in general. I think that could be a potential one.
Thank you. And Vanessa had a really great comment in the comments. And Vanessa, I'm not sure if would you be willing to state it off mic?
Sure, absolutely. Can you hear me? Great. Hi, I'm Vanessa, manager of DEI initiatives at the Regional Plan Association that is located in New York City, the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape. I am coming fresh actually from the Lakota Media Summit, which was hosted by Tatewin and her team at Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. So I am definitely fresh with inspiration, specifically on how to use our voices, our platforms, and the necessity to do our own internal healing, even for people who are people of color. Myself, I'm Filipino, I'm Asian, but we all have healing that we have to do from colonialism, specifically because we do our work on traditional, rightfully indigenous lands. Tatewin has, in our partnership and our work together, you've always referred to the original harm, and how if we are not able to do we can't move forward if we don't address the harm. So if we can take our time, I mean, it is Indigenous Peoples Day yesterday, and every day should be Indigenous Peoples Day. If we can do the work to both teach ourselves on what was done to the people who are the original stewards of this land, it's necessary. We all actively benefit from the displacement of Indigenous people. So it's important for us as people who are planners, community organizers, to intentionally undo that harm.
I can touch on that. I really appreciate the heartfelt sentiment. I think of it as true. I absolutely agree with that. I think of a couple of things. I think at first contact, when there was the Chumuk, say the Chumukama, the non-brown people came over, and our native people are sitting there. And the non-brown people, they start dealing out cards. They say, let's sit down. And they deal out these cards and they say, we're playing a game here. I got the jack, it wins. So I take everything. And then, our native people kind of say, oh, okay. It dealed it out. The next round, I get a jack. The native person, he says, yeah, I got a jack. Oh, hey, check it out. I win. Oh, no. This round, the jack doesn't win. See, I got a 2 that beats the jack this round. So I take it all. See, this is what's been happening since first contact is, first of all, we're playing those cards. We didn't know what those numbers were. We didn't speak the language. We're playing a game, your game, that the rules are consistently changed. So that's been the system. The system has never stayed the same. We can be assured of that. We know that to be true. The system has never stayed the same. It's been fluid. It's been changed all this time throughout history. So what else happened was, in that exchange, we know where all the power went. We know who is winning that game. And all the while, the power has, what happens when you give a young man good money and a good job and a good life? That young man or young lady stands up tall and they get proud and they walk tall. And the same holds true for the person who was, everything was gathered from, everything was taken from them. Then they start to slouch and they hang their head low. So that's a big part of what's going on. The systems that have perpetuated that motion amongst Native peoples. In my thoughts and opinions on that topic, if we are all going to sit around and permit the systems to continue to do that, then we are a part of the problem. So I fully agree, and I think we have to work for systems change. And that's why I'm sitting where I'm sitting today. I'm really loving this work.
Thank you, Derek. And Vanessa, thank you for the comments as well. I don't know if John or Tatewin, if you have additional comments. Otherwise, we also have 2 new questions in the chat. And so I might, for time's purposes, ask Hannah to ask her question, and then Iani to ask their question, and then the 3 of you can respond however you feel. Hannah?
Yeah, I can ask mine. Thanks, Juhi. So I'm interested in all of the perspectives of the panelists, but especially those working in urban environments. What advice you might have for folks who are working in local government to help shift this narrative around ownership? And so often we talk about local ownership as being a goal, and especially like tax increase, like tax-based increase being a metric that we use to measure success of a lot of development. And I'm just thinking about how to, like, with the broad stroke approach that we typically take towards equitable development, if you have any suggestions or things that have been successful for you in talking with folks about how to shift that narrative from like a policy perspective for people who are working in local government.
Maybe if you want to respond to that first, because there's such different questions. Derek, Tatewin.
Sure. I think I'm just wondering, Hannah, you want to shift the narrative away from home ownership? Just full disclosure, I am the board chair of the Minnesota Fund, which is a native CDFI here in Minneapolis, and we encourage home ownership. So maybe I'm not quite understanding the question, Hannah.
That is a great question. Thank you. Not necessarily shifting away from home ownership, but I think trying to integrate this idea that different communities have different relationships to land and land ownership, and trying to integrate policy approaches that might not necessarily be, this is our overall goal, is to have ownership be the ultimate goal endpoint for everyone, and try to bring in more understanding that different communities have different relationships to land and land ownership, and how can, like, as policymakers, how can we start to be more mindful of integrating that into the way that we talk about ownership and the way that we craft policy around ownership.
Interesting. Well, I can tell you that when I have a house, my whole family has a house. And that's pretty true with a lot of Native families. So, you know, home ownership is a big deal for us. We want to encourage that and promote it. I think, Hannah, I'm understanding your question in a way that, you know, I think, you know, a question about how Native people relate to the land, how we relate to our natural resources, you know, is really important. But, you know, I mean, buying a house, a Native person buying a house is our first step at land back, right? Not our first step, but a step in the land back movement.
I will add something there. So I think that there are examples of like community land trusts that have been utilized in different areas. And all I will say in regard to those, I think that's a great starting point, but I think that's where the community has to come together and think about what fits their community, what type of structure that is. That's, you know, anti-colonial and anti-land ownership model, but what is that? But that's for the community to decide. For us to sit here and be prescriptive of this, that, or the other, I think that's just continuing those really paternalistic policies that the government has implemented a lot of times. So I think you have to go back to communities and figure out what that looks like. But I know some have gone to community land trusts, just don't model it off the federal government's
Right.
land trust model with the BIA and what it does to our holding our land in trust. Very paternalistic, and they get it wrong every time. So if there's something not to do, it's what the BIA has done in Indian country. I think that could be some valuable advice.
Yeah, a quick add to that. I think you also engage in communities, organizations. I mean, you stay involved, you keep them involved, you ask the community where they stand, and they're trusted organizations, they're leaders that are in the community. It's very simple. Ask the people what they want and what they need.
Thank you. And Yanni had a question. I think that they had to log off, but I think it's similar around kind of negotiating these values of you know, shifting of the values of land and engagement and being in these, you know, structures that we have set for us in the government by government, and engaging Indigenous communities into that structure, because Yanni is with a neighborhood association. I forget what district council, but it's the one that covers Como. And so I believe in his question, he's asking about sovereignty for community with like larger Indigenous presence, but would they've done lots of outreach, and any suggestions for better ways to engage Indigenous communities while still trying to work with what they have from colonialism.
I have one suggestion. I think that you include Indigenous people on your decision-making mechanisms, whether that's your board, whether that's a part of your staff. Like I mentioned in one of the things I shared, like it's not something that we're tired of being consulted. Anytime the federal government does anything in Indian country, there's a tribal consultation, and it's always performative. So anything that you do it with intentionality, do it with, you know, from a place that's really genuine and sincere. And I think that the community feels that and appreciates that. And so having Indigenous people as a part of the decision-making circle is really important, and that we're not just consulted.
And the only thing I can add is we demand reciprocity when we work across community sectors, and you should too. You know, learn the medicines before you ask people. Just don't be extractive, you know, bring people some medicine, talk with them. I think that's a way that we can grow conversations in our areas.
I don't think I can add anything to that. That's perfect.
So sorry about that. John, can you define medicine in this instance?
Sure. So there's medicines for all the tribes. I'm Lakota, so we use tobacco, sweetgrass, sage, and cedar. And, you know, when we ask anybody for anything in our culture, we bring them some medicine before we ask. What I mean by extractive is many people tried to reach out to Native people to understand how to work in Indigenous communities, and they're not providing any reciprocity for that, or they're vague about what they're asking for. And so I'd like to encourage people to not practice those ways.
Thank you, everybody. And we are hitting time. This has been such a thought-provoking conversation, one that, again, I've been seeking for a long time. And so just deep appreciation to Tatewin, Darek, and John for your time and sharing of yourselves and your histories and the work that you're doing now. And to the comment that John just made around reciprocity, if it's appropriate, I would say some of reciprocity of giving back for today is donating to Thunder Valley and NACDI, or All My Relations, and the great work that you all are doing. I believe strongly in land back, And so giving back to you all to do the work that you do is one step. So thank you, everybody. We will look to create a recap of this. I'm not certain that we'll offer the recording itself, but we'll offer a recap of the conversation for people to continue learning from. So thank you.